Last episode, we talked about autistic Christianity, or at least what we tried to do is sketch out an understanding of how autistic people, generally speaking, practice the Christian faith. Now I think it would be a good time to talk not just about the way that we tend to interact with the Christian faith, but just autistic spiritual practice specifically, because I think that's its own necessary topic to cover, because it's a fairly large part of the Christian faith, the spiritual practice, that is. And we talked about how autistic people sometimes have a pretty unique understanding and way of going about spiritual practice. And so I think it would be good to just cover that here. Again, like I said in all the other episodes, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. If what we're describing here will not describe every autistic person's spiritual experience, and almost certainly there's going to be an autistic person listening to this and saying, that doesn't describe me. And I totally get that. I understand that. We're here describing large generalized trends, not specific instances. So yeah, just want to throw that out there. So I'm not trying to invalidate anyone or make them feel like their experiences aren't valid if you don't fall into what we're describing. But what I am going to describe is what I've noticed to be like general trends within the autism community. So the first thing I think we should probably try to define is spirituality. And this is something that a lot of autistic people really struggle with. One of the questions that I often ask autistic people is, do you consider yourself spiritual? And usually there's a lot of humming and hawing when I ask the question. They're like, well, maybe it depends on what you mean by spiritual. There are senses in which that might be a word that you could describe what I do. So that's probably the most common response. The next common response is no. Are you spiritual? No. A lot of autistic Christians will, there's that saying, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. A lot of autistic people like to take that and flip it and say, I'm not spiritual, I'm religious. And I think it's important to just talk about what we mean when we say spirituality, because a lot of autistic people intuitively associate spirituality with some sort of hyper emotionalism and anti-rationality. And they think of spirituality and it's this non-concrete thing. And oftentimes in Christianity, we don't help ourselves by contrasting spirituality with like intellectualism. And it's very, again, experiential, emotional, and that's typically how people describe it. And I think that's one of the main reasons that you'll see autistic people say, I'm not really spiritual. If you were to try to define it, Amy, how would you define spirituality?
Oh, that's a very good question, because I'd be one of the autistic people that would probably hum and ha if asked about it. Well, I might have during one of your interviews with me. Gosh, for me, spirituality is rather introspective. It's that more direct connection with God, and I know for each person that manifests in a different way. But yeah, it just, whereas like religion is the sort of the collective community in worship of God, spirituality, I equate that with faith, where it's more personal and, again, that more direct connection with God and whatever practices are born out of that. Yeah, that's my nutshell version of it.
Yeah, fair enough. Whenever I try to define spiritual practice, I go along those same lines where I just say, spiritual practices are the things you do to connect with the divine other. Maybe a little too influenced by like existentialism, but I'm really into Kierkegaard. I think Kierkegaard's a cool guy. And I found like a lot of the existential spirituality to be something that I can relate to and understand more. And so when I talk about spirituality, I talk about it in terms of spirituality isn't necessarily any specific form of expression or practice, but the way in which you connect with the divine other. And and specifically Christian spirituality would be the way that you connect with the divine God in like the Christian sense of God. And so when I'm talking about spirituality, that's typically what I'm trying to talk about or describe. In general, though, there is a perception within autistic Christians and outside of non-autistic Christians on the outside looking in that will see autistic people as inherently less spiritual. And
Yeah.
I don't think we're less spiritual. I think we're just less emotionally expressive, and the primary lens through which spirituality is expressed in contemporary forms of Christianity is through emotional expressiveness. And I don't think that makes you less spiritual. I just think that means you aren't conforming to specific cultural understandings of spiritual expression. And so I initially, when I started this research, I was of that same opinion that autistic people would just be significantly less spiritual. But as I really started to think more about what spirituality was and just talking to deeply engaged autistic people who are like deeply engaged in their Christian faith, I started to realize that what I was doing was not asking, are autistic people less spiritual? Or I wasn't observing that autistic people were less spiritual. I was observing that autistic people were less likely to engage in non-autistic forms of spiritual expression. But there are a lot of senses in which I find autistic people are very spiritual. And the way that I would say they're very spiritual is in four main components of the expression of Christian faith, or that
Right.
expression of that interaction with the divine other. And
Hmm.
I think those four things would be responding to pain in the world. So that's a really big thing that you'll see in autistic Christian spiritual practice, is when you ask them about how Christianity affects their life, they'll often talk about being in solidarity with other people who are suffering, and going through that like very rich part of the Christian tradition, which is all about suffering with the other.
Yeah.
There's another aspect which is like contemplation, sitting there and thinking about stuff is the easiest way I can say that. Just
Yeah.
like trying to know the mind of God, or to know how God is interacting with the world or with you. The next two are a lot more concrete. So, number one would be engaging in ritual. So, autistic people are very spiritually expressive through ritual. And
Yes.
what I mean by this is like very much a big thing that I've noticed, especially with autistic women, especially autistic Catholic women, is they love the rosary and other
I
forms
feel so attacked
of
right
like
now.
ritual prayer. Yeah.
So attacked
It's
right
cool. I
now.
think it's cool. But yeah, it's a really big thing, and getting
Mm.
into a lot of the, I don't want to say this incorrectly, but like the cultic devotional practices of Catholicism or Orthodoxy that you don't really see in Protestantism.
Oh yeah.
So a lot of autistic people, especially again autistic women, will be very interested in engaging in various ritual prayer, or like ritual, or observing different feasts and things like that, and basically going through the devotion to the saints in a very like specific way, where a lot of times if you want to know the patron saint for thing X, I'll just, if I don't want to Google it, I'll just hit up the closest autistic woman I know in the Catholic Church, and they'll be able to tell me. But it's a really big part, and even
Yeah.
for those of us who aren't in Catholicism or Orthodoxy, even on the Protestant side, I find a lot of us, one, drift toward the ritualistic side of Protestant worship. So, like we talked about in previous episodes, there's that sort of high church drift. So
Yeah.
within Protestantism, a lot of us end up within more high church Lutheran or Anglican contexts. A lot of us end up that way because the way that spirituality is expressed in those contexts is through the liturgy, and a lot of us just really the liturgy. There's a lot of it that's safe, but not just safe, but also there is a genuine way that we connect, I find, through ritual and through repetition, that the liturgy really helps us with. And then related to that ritual part, I find that autistic Christians are disproportionately more likely to be very into sacramentalism.
Oh, yeah.
So for those of you who don't know, that means the church has certain sacraments or practices that are like set apart as holy. So one of the biggest ways that you see this expressed is that a lot of autistic people, even in traditions that don't typically express it, will believe in like the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. So like that's in communion, for example. A lot of autistic people really like the idea of it not being symbolic and it being a real, genuine, tangible thing. And I think when I interviewed you, Amy, you
Yeah.
expressed like the way that you meet God was through the Eucharist. And that's like a super common autistic spiritual sentiment that you'll find.
It can be quite profound too. I think part of the reason being that the sacraments generally integrate our physical senses. I know in the Catholic Church, for example, we have 7 sacraments. Protestant churches, for the most part, have adopted these sacraments, but usually only consider 2 or 3 of them to be actual sacraments and others to be just practices. The 2 that tend to be universally agreed upon between Catholics, Orthodox, and High Church Protestants are the sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist. And it's, for me, I feel like it's no coincidence that those are the 2 that are shared by all, because those are the ones that incorporate the senses to its fullest extent. Baptism, you're being immersed or sprinkled with water, so there's a physicality there. And of course, the Eucharist, you're eating and drinking and partaking in the body and blood of Christ. And again, like the High Church Protestants have some belief in real presence, although that varies. And obviously Orthodox and Catholics really substantially believe in the real presence as well, just have different ways of interpreting it and understanding it. But there is that commonality there that I have noticed. I'm not surprised that a lot of other autistic people have also described the Eucharist as being a very profound way in which we have that connection with God, because it is obviously, it's such a direct thing. You believe that the body, that the bread and the wine and the body and blood of Christ, and that's very direct. And we like direct. We don't oversimplify it, that's for sure, but we do like something to have that direct connection.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest components of it, like you said, is like the concreteness of it. There is something you touch, there is something you taste, there's something you feel. Like there isn't a lot of metaphor, really, when you think of it, and there isn't much abstraction. No. Now, there can be if you would like there to be, but I found that for autistic people, there often isn't a lot of metaphor and abstraction when it comes to this stuff. So like whenever we talk about spirituality, we talk about like what is it, but like how is it expressed? And like the typical ways that you see spirituality expressed is through prayer, worship, study, reflection and contemplation, self-improvement, service to others, and there are probably a lot more things that I just haven't included there. But when you're looking at like how do you tangibly see it, that's typically how. The biggest 2, especially in Protestant circles, is like through prayer and worship. And while like autistic people do participate in all these things to various different degrees, I find that instead of saying autistic people do these spiritual practices, not these, we do all of them, and we do all of them to various degrees. And depending on a lot will depend on the person and the context they're in. But I found that there are usually 5 major defining characteristics that help shape how a lot of autistic spiritual practice actually expresses itself. So the 5 things that I've noticed, like 5 principles that I guess help better describe autistic spirituality. The first one is head, not heart, meaning a lot of autistic spiritual expression is very heavily mediated through the intellect, not through the feelings. The next one, unsurprisingly, repetition, ritual, and formula. So the final one is, the third one is that it's measurable and material. The fourth one is that autistic spirituality is often very justice-oriented, and very much focused on doing things that are in line with Christian ethics. And then the fifth principle, which a lot of people find very counterintuitive, is that autistic spiritual practice tends to be communal rather than individual. A lot of these characteristics overlap a lot with the definitions of like autistic Christianity that we talked about last podcast. But this podcast, we're going to talk about how those specifically overlap with spiritual practice. When I talk to most autistic Christians and I ask them about their spiritual practices, usually you'll get 5 things said most commonly. The first one is introspection and reflection concerning God. If you ask, well, what sorts of spiritual practices do you do? And they're like, I do a lot of thinking and introspection. The next one is studying theology, church history, or other stuff like that, where, you ask them, what sorts of things what sorts of spiritual practices do you do? And they're like, I just read this large commentary on the book of Job. It's like cool stuff. Next thing that we already talked about, participation in Eucharist and the Mass is a big one for a lot of us, even the Protestants. The next one that you'll see is usually structured prayers and routine structured prayers. So you ask them, what is your spirituality? And they will say, at this time in the day, or generally speaking, once a day, I do this prayer or this set of prayers. And then the next thing they'll say is they'll talk about serving their community in some way. So let's talk a little more about head, not heart, or that principle. And I say head, not heart, because a lot of times in Christian circles, we talk about head knowledge and heart knowledge and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think we started the podcast about talking about that specifically. And a lot of times what this is trying to say is you need to feel it, not think it. And it can't just be something you think about. It needs to be something you feel. And this often is language that gets unfortunately weaponized against autistic people and tends to give us some pretty negative experiences with Christian spiritual expression. And I think a lot of these sorts of attitudes are the reason why a lot of autistic Christians will say, I'm not spiritual, I'm religious, because they look at spiritual practice as being heart, not head. But really, I think when a lot of those people say, I'm religious, not spiritual, what they're trying to get across is that the way I interact with this divine other is through thinking, not about feeling. Again, that's not to say autistic people are feelingless or anything about that. It's just that, like, you know how people sometimes talk about like love languages? Autistic people, we have different love languages, and we have different ways of expressing love languages, right? Yeah. We've talked about this before on the podcast, but sometimes autistic love languages are information dumping about your favorite topic. And that's a genuine form of autistic love.
And autistic joy.
And it's really, and it's really hard to express that within like a worship service. It's not really something that really makes sense that way. And so instead, what a lot of autistic people will do is they will take that impulse that they feel like genuinely deep inside of them, that like the way that I show love to people is talking about the things that I've found and the information that I've collected. A lot of us channel that way of interacting with other people towards God, and meaning that a lot of the ways that we like try to practice love of God is through, developing our thoughts and understandings about particular things within the church. And so again, one of the most common things you'll hear when you ask autistic people about their spiritual practices is they'll talk about the books they've read recently, or a lot of times there'll be more spiritual books. So what have you done recently? And they're like, oh, I read this specific medieval mystic, or I've been reading the Desert Fathers or something like that.
So, again, okay, I feel very seen right now. I feel very perceived.
Good. I hope other people are feeling that. But yeah, like if there's one thing that I can pretty much guarantee that I'll find in most autistic Christians that I talk to, about their spiritual practice is like spiritual study is like a critical part of the way that we try to express this interaction with the divine. And this leads to some pretty interesting characteristics of autistic Christianity or of autistic spiritual expression, because spiritual expression looks really different when one of your main ways of doing spiritual expression is through like reading and consuming information about Christianity and like partaking in one-sided info dumping with God. It doesn't quite look like how most people think when they're like, I'm spending time with God. A lot of us will be like, we won't use that language because mostly we're not taught to use that language to talk about what we're doing. Yeah, so it will express itself in that way. And so again, I think one of the problems is that there's a sort of cart before the horse problem where autistic people don't describe themselves as spiritual because the spiritual practices that we typically engage in aren't considered spiritual practices. They're considered something else. But for us, they actually are spiritual because we think about things differently.
Yeah.
And so we call ourselves non-spiritual because we engage spiritually in a method of interacting with Christianity in a way that's typically deemed non-spiritual. And so I think a lot of this perception about autistic people not being spiritual is a result of this type of thing. And I think a lot of people really misunderstand what's going on here, because a lot of people will see the way that autistic people are expressing their own faith in terms that make sense to them. And they'll say, this isn't how I understand it, and this isn't how I do it. And the things that are meaningful to me, I'm not seeing in you. So therefore, you must be doing something wrong.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, in previous episodes, we talked about relational doctrine and how that relates to autism and kind of the negative things there. And people consent or stump who talk about spiritual autism or use autism as a shorthand for being cut off from God. I think what's going on there is not that we're cut off from God, but that what's going on there is they're basically saying these particular ways that I engage with spiritual expression, I'm not seeing in you. Therefore, you're not actually engaging in spiritual practices. And for me, I don't get the way that autistic people uniquely emotionally attach to information sharing or information processing. Because most people don't, I find they just don't know what it's like to be autistic and don't know the deep joy and affection and emotion that we feel when we're really into something. Most people don't know the feeling of that deeply obsessive special interest that just gives us
you go hard, we go home.
Yeah, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm interested in things. And it's like, are you though? Are you really? Do you know? And because a lot of them don't have that experiential relationship with information processing that a lot of autistic people do, the head knowledge gets significantly denigrated as this lesser form of, oh, you just know things about God. You don't know God. And it's like, no, that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is a completely different way of interacting and understanding God mediated through an autistic person's mind. And it isn't something that you recognize, probably because you're not autistic. The problem here isn't that we're cut off from God. The problem is that you are cut off from our experience. And instead of going like, maybe some people just have some fundamental differences in the way they experience the world, they go, no, you're wrong. And I just don't think that's a particularly good or helpful way to look at things. And because we tend to look at these things, and another recurring theme of this podcast is hegemony, where like, because non-autistic people make up most of the church, most expressions of Christianity are non-autistic. And those expressions that fall outside of the non-autistic expressions are considered like invalid and stuff like that. And I very much think that's what's going on here. But I also think it's important to recognize that like this intellectualism is like a really important part of the autistic spiritual experience. And I think we should have a little more perspective from non-autistic people should maybe have a little more perspective and understanding when they're talking about this and not weaponize the lack of hyper emotional expression and the overemphasis on intellectualization, and understand that for us it actually works really differently. If you aren't autistic and you're looking at autistic spiritual expression, it can often look pretty wooden or rigid. It will often lack spontaneity. It will usually be pretty planned, pretty repetitive, and pretty dry. And usually there's a sort of like rigid insistence on sameness from a set of practices. So, for example, I'll give you one from my personal life. One of my priests in a church that I no longer attend decided that he would just start changing up the words in the Eucharistic prayer at communion. I was not a fan. You know, if you ask me what my ideal religious service would be, or what changes I would make, I would say I wouldn't want to change anything. And a lot of people, for them, spirituality, there's a lot of like creativity and deviation from the norm and be spontaneous. And that simply isn't how a lot of us are.
No.
I'm sure some of us are like that, but most of us, when we're doing spiritual expression, we like to stick to the formula, to follow the patterns and follow the routines. So like a lot of times autistic people will do a lot of like route memorization of prayers or short phrases or Bible verses and insist on it staying the same and not doing different ones. And a lot of times, just in general, autistic people can be quite monotone. So you've probably noticed listening to this podcast that I don't really have a lot of variation in my voice, and I can be quite monotone. And that's a characteristic of many autistic people, that we just don't have a lot of verbal inflection. And it's just how we sound. And a lot of people mistake that for a lack of sincerity or a lack of enthusiasm or a lack of care. And that simply isn't the case. It's just the way that we talk, because we have different perceptions on the social and like communication patterns that people use. And one of the things that like took me a really long time to learn is that people meant different things by their tones. And so I just didn't grow up making tonal variation because I didn't think tonal variation was something important that I needed to do. And like these types of phenomena, they make their way into spiritual practice. If you think of spirituality and spiritual practice as communicating with the divine other, and you realize autistic people communicate in some very straightforward, direct, formulaic ways, we really shouldn't be surprised when that expression finds itself in spiritual communication instead of just interpersonal communication.
Yeah.
Yeah, something that I just want to make clear, that hopefully I've been making it clear, is that the vast majority of practicing autistic Christians have an active spiritual life, and they will engage in spiritual practices as much as everyone else, but they tend to express it quite differently. And yeah, there are lots of autistic people who often they don't have traditional or formulaic prayers in their tradition, like non-liturgical traditions, especially like more charismatic or evangelical traditions that autistic people belong to. Those of us who don't have those formulas already given to us will typically end up building their own. It is one of the most interesting things that I found, and especially interviewing a lot of evangelical autistic Christians. A lot of them, in lieu of having traditions given to them that they can use, they will simply invent their own traditions and their own formulas of doing things that they like to do sense. And stick to.
Yeah.
And like it's just another big thing in autistic spiritual practice that a lot of people don't quite get, is that we're usually very focused on the tangible and concrete, and not the non-tangible and abstract. And
Yeah.
we tend to be very concerned with things and stuff, and not feelings and concepts. We're more interested in spirituality that involves actual concrete tangible things that we can touch, taste, feel, and see. And so even a lot of autistic people, again, who aren't in the high church traditions, will often get a lot out of like religious art and things like that,
Yeah.
because it has that visual tangible aspect. And like we talked about before in one of our earlier episodes, like the autistic preference for multisensory experiences that they often don't get. A lot of us find verbal communication very difficult.
Yes.
A lot of us just really struggle with that. And so nonverbal other sensory modes of spiritual expression can often be very heavily relied on by autistic people. And when a non autistic person is looking at it, it can seem awkward or unintuitive or lacking meaning. I get a lot of autistic people telling me that's how they're perceived, where people will be like, you're a Christian, you're not into Christianity, you should be, and stuff like that. And it's usually because of that. There's this saying, I completely forget who said it. I think sometimes it's attributed to Einstein, but I don't know if he said it.
A lot of stuff's attributed
it's
to
some,
him. He didn't
yeah.
say. Yeah.
Yeah. One of his famous phrases, don't believe everything you hear on the internet.
Thought
I
that's
think Lincoln also said that one. Yeah, it might. Hey, all of them might have said it. It's a really important thing to understand. But yeah, like the phrase is, everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it's stupid. And
Yeah.
I think that this applies to a lot of the way that autistic spirituality gets affected in Christianity, where, try to phrase it like, everyone has access to God, but if you tell an autistic person that their access to God is mediated through neurotypical relational processes, they'll probably live their whole life believing that God has abandoned them. And those of us who figured out that what's actually going on is that we're autistic and we just deal with things differently, kind of embrace this head, not heart mode of spiritual expression. And it typically works quite well for us. And so what I'm trying to say here is that a lot of autistic people don't appear to be spiritual, and a lot of autistic people will tell themselves that they're not spiritual. But really what's going on is they've internalized narratives of what spiritual expression should be without actually thinking about what their own spiritual practice is and why it's still totally valid, even though it doesn't look like all of the people around them.
Yeah.
Like if you were not to give autistic people guidelines and expectations for engagement, the kind of natural way that a lot of autistic people would express their spirituality is through this intellectual engagement. And I talk to a lot of autistic people about this, and the number of times I've had to explain things. It's okay that you would rather be reading a book than go to an emotional worship service. You shouldn't have these expectations that you will express yourself emotionally or that you will have this intuitive heart knowledge. It's okay that you don't. Your brain works differently. You don't understand a lot of the abstract relational concepts. That's fine, because you do understand these completely different set of concepts, which are just as valid and just as important, and for you are probably more valid and more important because you can actually relate to them and you can actually understand them.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I just wanted to hammer on this so hard because it's something I see all the time. And it's something that I think is really important to express, that what's going on with autistic spirituality is not a lack of heart engagement. It's a type of head engagement that a non-autistic person probably just can't understand. Or maybe they can understand it, but they will likely not have the same experiential understanding of what's actually going on.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and I think what you shared there is like quite important, especially about the, an autistic person feeling like they've been abandoned by God if they can't connect with God in this neurotypical way. And I've described before, I don't know if I mentioned it in the interview with you, but I have done some media engagement here in Australia where I've appeared on TV talking about my connection with being an autistic person and growing up under the group that I grew up in. And unfortunately, when you have these high demand control groups like the one that I was raised in, when they expect a particular expression of faith, it's like your entire salvation is hinged on it, and it just, the pressure is cranked up because again, it's a high pressure, it's a high control, high demand group. And so a lot of autistic people who are in these kinds of groups, in these kinds of cults and that sort of thing, that can be quite a dangerous situation to be in, both physically and emotionally and spiritually as well, because that more so, that sense that God has abandoned them can really set in. And I myself described it as nearly being robbed of my relationship with God, because I just felt that it was like, okay, there's clearly something wrong with me, or God does not exist. And I couldn't stick with the premise of God not existing. I tried. I didn't even last 2 weeks. Oh my gosh. Like I'm trying to think back. And I tried being an atheist, and that was a nice 10 days, I guess. But it's been, in some ways it's worse. The other outcome is worse. It's that feeling that, okay, God does exist, but for whatever reason, I am like, my mere existence is doing something wrong because I try everything. I try to do, and then being told, no, but you shouldn't be trying because it should just be a natural relationship with God. And you just end up in this loop. And it's like the hamster in the wheel. It just never ends. And until something gives. And I do like credit the fact that after getting out of that environment and getting to work things out myself, just being that, oh, I actually have room here to explore. I don't have to feel bad about exploring things more on the intellectual side, because the use of the high emotion ecstatic spirituality, unfortunately, in that particular context, was used as one of the tools of controlling the people within the group. And I'm not saying that's the case in all churches that have more emotional, ecstatic forms of spiritual practice, but it just was in that particular context for me. And I think as well, understanding, I brought it up earlier, but this idea of autistic joy, where it's joy as autistic people express it. And we express it in the context where we are just free to be totally ourselves, no filters, no masks, nothing. And it's difficult to describe because it is just pure bliss, really. When you're in this state where you are so comfortably yourself that you are then just deeply fulfilled and happy to be. And a lot of the head versus heart thing is such a false dichotomy in many respects for autistic people, because then when we deep dive into these heavily intellectual expressions of Christianity, reading theology, reading up on the history of the church and the peoples of that time and the context and all of that, we derive so much joy from that experience because of that concreteness, that way of, in many respects, making God feel more real, because it's like through that we see, wow, this is where God has had his hand on things, because there's no other way to describe it. Because if you read up on all of this history and theology, it gets pretty wacky at times. You go, my goodness, how did we get to here from there? This is pretty bonkers. And you can probably hear it in my voice now, like even just summarizing it just makes me really happy to discuss. And I think that's where not only autistic people are really missing out, but I think this is where the wider church also misses out, because they're missing this chance to connect with other ways of loving and appreciating God and each other as people. And I think, so I think that's why I never like the head versus heart thing. It's just such a false dichotomy, especially with autistic people. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. No, a lot of times I say head is heart. for us.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you absolutely can't separate like those things. Maybe some people can, I certainly can't. But I think another component, just to go on what you're talking about autistic joy, is one factor that I found that sort of mediates autistic joy is being able to be yourself, because
Yes.
so much of the time you are expected to not be yourself. And I think that's like an important thing for people to understand, is that a lot of times it like those feelings, you feel like sometimes a 10,000 pound weight has just been lifted off of you when you're in those situations in which you can feel that unmediated joy, because most of the time
Yes.
you feel like you have to carry this 10,000 pound weight around with you. And the 10,000 pound weight is mostly just other people's social expectations of you.
Mm.
And I think that ties in pretty well to what we've been trying to explain here.
Mm.
But yeah, no, I think what you said there is just, yeah, absolutely right. Um, yeah, so the next one, repetition, ritual, and formula, something that just permeates the vast majority of autistic spiritual
Mm.
practice.
Yeah.
So over and over and over again, when I ask autistic people what they're doing for their spiritual practices, and they'll be like, well, I like to do the same thing a lot. I've read Romans for the 100th time this year. Was one of the conversations I had. Or like I said, especially I found autistic women are like super into praying the rosary and a lot of the Marian devotion aspects of
Mm.
Catholicism,
Yeah. Yeah.
and praying Hail Marys and doing all that stuff. Super common thing for them to bring up. And it's not just like ritual and repetition that we find comforting, but there's aspects to autistic spiritual practice that involve stimming. So a lot of autistic people in their private spiritual practice, usually not in public ones, will
Mm.
incorporate stimming into their spirituality. So we
Oh,
talked
yeah.
about stimming before, but for those who maybe miss that, it's a form of self-regulatory soothing where
Mm.
you repeatedly do the same movement or bodily movement over and over and over and over. And it's a method of making us still, which seems counterintuitive because we're moving, but it is a way. If I need to calm my mind, one of the things that I need to do is stim. And so a lot of us, so one of the things that I do for prayer is I walk. I have to be in movement and I have to be in
Oh,
motion. And
yeah.
I've never been able to just stop, sit, close my eyes, and pray. That doesn't feel right to me, at least for extended periods of time.
Hmm.
Um, and a big thing that I found in the way that a lot of people are told to do individual spiritual practice, a lot of autistic people find it really uncomfortable because they don't incorporate their own stimming and self-soothing into it. Like they're told to be still and
Oh.
really do this. But for autistic people, a lot of times that's being still or trying to force yourself to be still instead of allowing yourself to stim can actually have the opposite effect that you're intending it to have. But yeah, so um yeah, stimming as part of ritual is something that I found a lot of autistic people will incorporate into their prayer. And
Mm.
it's just, there's also just an aspect of when you're autistic, the world is often a very scary and anxiety inducing place. There's
Mm.
a lot of uncertainty, lots of things aren't the same. You have all these expectations of unwritten rules and things that just give you a lot of anxiety. And so having your spiritual practice not be different and having your spiritual practice being the same comforting, normalized thing is something that a lot of us just really need. And if we want to enter that kind of flow state of spiritual expression, the only way for us to get there or to access that is through like repeatable, predictable, and formulaic modes of spiritual expression. And I find it very hard to describe to non-autistic people because they're like, this seems wooden or this seems repetitive, and it is, but that's a good thing.
It's almost like a lot of it's almost like an autistic equivalent to a lot of the neurotypical mindfulness practices that are incorporated, because a lot of neurotypical people gain into mindfulness because of the calming effect that it has for them and centering themselves in the situation. That a lot of studies have shown that doesn't work quite as well for autistic people. And yeah, these repetitive and ritualistic practices that are more external actually have more of a positive effect on autistic people that the mindfulness practices have on neurotypical people, which is that calming of the mind and the heart rate and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and so there's an autistic Twitter user who posted a tweet, and you actually mentioned it in the previous episode.
I did,
but I'm going to bring it up again. And the tweet said, autistic people are more likely to be irreligious than the general population. But for me, I was drawn to the version with all the rituals, like making the sign of the cross or praying the rosary. And I think that is the experience for a lot of autistic Christians. Yeah. And you'll find a lot of autistic Christians who come back to the faith.
Yeah, sorry. He replied, he actually followed that tweet up with another one that said prayer and stimming. I remember that.
Yes.
As well, which I was like, oh, damn, that's a perfect summation right there.
And I think that's absolutely the way it goes. And a lot of autistic people who come back to Christianity after being out for a while, who know they're autistic, especially, will intentionally come back to the versions of Christianity that have all of the rituals and all of these signs and things like that. And yeah, so I just think that's a really important thing to talk about, and something that enters a lot of Christian or autistic Christian spiritual expression that people might not fully understand. The next expression or the next tendency is that autistic spiritual expression tends to be measurable and material. So what do I mean by this? Because spirituality is often talking about the immaterial. But for autistic people, we tend to define our spiritual practices in terms of tangible things that involve, I like to say, stuff and things. Most autistic spiritual practice isn't connecting or relationalizing or doing something like that. And that isn't to say that none of us do that. And the way I like to say it is it's less of how do I get to know God and more of what can I do to make myself closer to who Jesus was. And I don't know if this is another way to say it is rather than relational, it's devotional. So it's not focused on the relational building, it's focused on devotional practice of doing things. And so there's, again, with the love languages thing, in the autistic community, there's a joke about the autistic love languages. And I saw this article and I thought of you, or here's something about your favorite thing, or I would like to spend unstructured time with you, or you can share silence beside me, or I can research your problem for you and here are your options. And you can't really do any of these things with God, but you can in some way do them when you change your focus from relational to devotional. And when you ask an autistic person, what sorts of spiritual practices are you doing? And I found when I asked non-autistic people this, they talk about their relationship with God and building their relationship with God. But for autistic people, they will say, these are the books I'm reading. These are the prayers I perform.
Yeah.
These are the places that I volunteer. These are the types of things these are the virtues I've been trying to cultivate. And they'll talk about, when you ask them what they've been doing spiritually, they'll give you a list of things that they've done. And I just find that's the way that we think about things, right? It's just in terms of abstract and abstract emotional, but more in terms of concrete. Here, you want to know my spirituality? Here's a list of 5 things that I did last week. And it's just a characteristic for a lot of us that most of what we're concerned with are things that are measurable and material. So another big one is that autistic spirituality tends to be justice oriented. There's a lot to say here. We talked about last episode how justice oriented means different things to different people of different political persuasions. But one of the things that is very common across all autistic spirituality, it has a very strong ethical component, and it is very heavily ethically oriented. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. I joke that it's not really a joke because I actually see it all the time, but there's a autistic socialist to autistic Christian socialist pipeline, and it's there. Maybe we'll do an episode on it.
Yeah.
or just like maybe a future episode where we'll do like a grab bag of random topics. But it's there where a lot of autistic people who aren't Christian, but who are in leftist political circles, they'll see Christianity and they'll really like certain components of it. And they'll slowly come to Christianity from the left's perspective, but mostly because of a lot of the more justice-oriented passages from the Bible. If you look, I think I've mentioned this before, but if you look at autistic bios, like for social media, where people put in their bios, so you look at non-autistic Christians and see which verses are quoted, and then you look at autistic Christians and see what verses are quoted. You get a lot of like so Micah 6:8 is a super common one, which is, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, show mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Another one is Galatians, I believe it's 3:28, which is, in Christ there is no man, there is no woman, there is no slave, there is no free, there is no Greek, there is no Jew, for all are one in Christ, which is very egalitarian. The next most common one is James chapter 5, which is, weep and bewail you, rich, for the misery that is coming for you. You have lived your life in luxury and self-indulgence. You are fattening yourself for the day of slaughter. All those fun things. And I find like, autistic people love that stuff. Like autistic Christians are super into it. And a lot of autistic converts, especially adult converts, become adult converts because of a lot of the very strong themes of justice that you find within Christianity. When you talk to autistic people and you talk about which Christians in the past do you admire, or which ones would you aspire to be, you'll get a lot of answers. Some of them are like, this church father or this saint or something like that. But then you'll also get like John Brown. For those who don't know, John Brown led a violent slave revolt, which he believed he was on a mission from God to liberate the slaves in America, and raided an armory at Harper's Ferry with a bunch of freed slaves, and is often cited as one of the reasons that the American Civil War was kicked off. He was a very radical abolitionist. But you'll also get people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German theologian during Nazi Germany, who was part of the Confessing Church, which was the Christians in Germany who were actively opposing the Nazis. And he was martyred at the concentration camps after being part of a plot to kill Hitler. You'll get a lot of autistic people, especially Black autistic Christians, who will talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and a lot of the other people within the very radical Black Christian tradition. So a lot of James Cone's and things like that. A lot of autistic Christians are very into liberation theology.
Yes. Including yours truly.
It just is. Yeah. It's just the way things go. And particularly when you talk about like favorite quotations from church fathers, I have a collection of them. Maybe again in a bonus episode we'll go through some of the fun things I've collected. But a lot of autistic Christians really like a lot of the church fathers, particularly when they're talking about, how all wealth is derived from injustice and stuff like that. And they'll have those quotes in their bios, or they'll talk about it at length. And I could give hundreds of examples of these things. And so that's the left-wing side of it. There is this tendency as well on the right-wing side of things, but typically autistic Christians who are politically on the right will instead focus on issues such as abortion, where they'll be like very fervently anti-abortion, and that's the thing, or very interested in preserving women's rights with respect to things like surrogacy and stuff like that. You do find a lot of, I would say most autistic Christians are not in that category. There are significant amounts that are there, so it's not like, I don't want to pretend these people don't exist. I'm not politically aligned with them, but there are other justice concerns on the political right that aren't as popular on the political left, that autistic Christians, when they're in that category, will be extremely focused on as well.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure that we're not getting the idea that every autistic Christian is a communist, although not everyone is, but I will say it is disproportionate when you look at the ones that are. If you were to survey most practicing autistic Christians, I would say most of them are at least on the politically progressive side of things, if not explicitly leftist. So I would differentiate that from like liberal, in that while you will find people who are liberal, often a lot of autistic Christians are like farther to the left than liberal.
Yeah.
And, you know, you will often see some very interesting dynamics where there's like a horseshoe theory, but for autistics, where the more conservative they get with their theology, the farther left their politics become. The more and more Christian they get, the more and more radically left-wing they'll get at the same time. It's just something I've noticed. I can't quite explain the exact reason, but I think it's because a lot of the parts of the Christian tradition that we can easily grasp and readily access and like immediately go, oh yeah, I understand that, I know what to do with it, are the parts that talk about injustice and inequity and things like that. So when I talk to most autistic Christians about the biggest ethical concerns they have, they will usually say things like housing security or fair pay or worker exploitation. In the States, especially Medicare and stuff like that. Not so much in countries with like universal healthcare, but other things, other really big things that you'll see in a lot of autistic Christians are, you know, concerns around racism, climate change, gender equality, treatment of LGBTQ people. One of the things I mentioned before in a previous episode is that I was doing data collection, and the data collection happened before and after the rise of Donald Trump in America. And that actually led to significant numbers of autistic people starting to question their faith online when they started seeing that, and they started going through deconstruction because they thought, they were like, no, Christians aren't supposed to support this. This isn't what we're supposed to be doing, because again, not everyone, but a fairly substantial chunk of autistic people had this idea of justice and fairness and equality. And then all of a sudden, the people in their church that they thought were on board with the same project all of a sudden started supporting someone who they were like, no, you're not on the same side as us. And that led to a lot of cognitive dissonance. And another big thing that you'll see caused a lot of cognitive dissonance for autistic Christians were Christian responses to the BLM movement, so Black Lives Matter, and the killing of unarmed Black people in the United States. A lot of churches in the States did not respond to that in the most racially sensitive way, I'll say. A lot of them politicized. A lot of them politicized and polarized over it and went to the opposite extreme end of things. And I have lots of documented evidence of this. Autistic Christians in those churches did not take that well. And a very common thing you'll see, especially in ex-Christian narratives, is autistic Christians were in these churches, and then all of a sudden they started saying some racist things with the rise of Black Lives Matter, and they were like, I'm not on board with this. But for those of us who do stay, these things tend to be very important to us. So one of the things that I have to tell Christians, especially when they're trying to talk to other autistic people or college campus ministers and stuff like that, who are like, how do I get through to these autistic people? One of the things I tell them is they have to check their politics at the door. So check your personal politics at the door and understand that these issues are they tend to be extremely important to us. And again, this isn't every autistic. There are autistic people on the right who have a whole nother set of issues, and a
Oh
whole
yeah.
nother set of things
Oh yeah.
that they're interested in. But generally speaking, though, from the data that I've collected, a lot of them are extremely focused on this. And regardless of whether autistic people are politically on the left, in the center, or on the right, a lot of them will really care about how you treat people who are on the margins. Who is on the margins, according to them, may vary depending on their political affiliations, but it is a very large component of Christian spirituality, and especially of autistic spirituality, is caring for people who are on the margins. And fairness, equality, all these things tend to be really important to us. So yeah, I will say, again, just to make sure that I'm not, just so people don't think that I'm ignoring a large portion of the more reactionary autistic Christians out there, those do exist. But what's going on is the exact same impulse, but just through a different political lens. And so a lot of more conservative autistic Christians, or reactionary autistic Christians who are like alt-right or on the far right, will look at things like anti-LGBT activism as a justice issue. They genuinely think that what they're doing is they are fighting to promote justice and to protect people. And when you talk to them and when you ask them, why do you believe this? They are genuinely convinced that the way that LGBT issues are being handled in society is a justice issue that they need to address. So don't be confused and thinking all autistic people are on the left, or if you are on the left, don't be confused and thinking that this justice orientation always serves the left. Although, like I've said, general trends, autistic people tend to be, politically speaking, on the left. This does show up and express itself across all parts of the political spectrum. The common thread between all of them is they genuinely think what they are doing is they are fighting for equality, and they are trying to help people on the margins or people who are disadvantaged. But yeah, that's a really big part of autistic spirituality, because helping people and caring for people and helping the poor and helping the needy however they can, or through whatever means they think is the right means to do it, is how a lot of autistic people express it. I will say I'm part of a few explicitly left, political Christian communities, and some centrist Christian communities, and some right-wing Christian communities. And I will say that the communities on the left contain by far the highest proportion of autistic Christians than every other group. It is just a thing. Like, if you want to find autistic Christians, find a politically left set of Christians, and the autistics will show themselves.
Proportionally high. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it's a lot of it is because, like, spiritual expression through focusing on justice and the justice orientation is a really big component. So the final component that, again, a lot of people find really counterintuitive, I've noticed when I give presentations, is that autistic spirituality tends to be communal, not individual. So a lot of people find this counterintuitive because autistic people don't seem very social, but, like, at the end of the day, we're still people, right? Like, it's not that autistic people don't like other people. It's often that we find it really difficult to relate to and interact with them. And, like, one of the aspects of autistic spirituality is that we like people and we like doing things with other people. It's just we often have times properly expressing ourselves in those situations. And I find a lot of autistic people don't tend to like to do things by themselves, and they don't like to engage in spiritual practices by themselves individually. They'll often have individual practices, but a lot of them will say things like attending church. If you list, like, favorite spiritual activities, going to services, attending mass, going to small groups, like doing those types of things, engaging in discussions with other people. For autistic people who are musically inclined, they love singing. And it's just
Oh,
like
yeah.
singing in the group.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm not one of those, but there are many autistic people who do. I think I've mentioned this before, but like for autistic people, we either like love singing or we just don't at all. And there often there isn't uh a super middle ground position on there. Some of us
No.
are like, I could take it or leave it. It's not really something I find super important. But for a lot of musically inclined autistics, they're like, I love singing and I love going to services where they're singing, and pretty much all I do is go for the singing. But it's never like singing by themselves. It's always I like to go to the other people to sing. And then probably the form of autistic spiritual expression that most of us love is actually teaching and speaking to other Christians about our niche Christian interests. This is something
Yeah.
that I point out to a lot of people when they ask me, like, how do I get the autistic people in my congregation more engaged? I often say, just talk to those people and ask them what they want to do, and they'll probably tell you. A really big way that you can get autistic people like positively engaged with their community is to ask them to help teach about something that they're really interested in. And so this is something that I've done a lot, where I've
Yeah.
been like, okay, you're autistic and you're really interested in, I don't know, Victorian era fashion. How about we talk about the various Christian influences in these things and how this works? And they're like, wow, yeah, I'd love to do that.
Yeah.
That'd be great for the group because they will learn something they never thought they would learn. And
Yeah.
and they benefit because they get to learn things. And the autistic people get to benefit because one, they feel useful, two, they feel included, and three, they get to info dump. And so a lot of autistic people love it. Some won't like it, and some will,
Yeah.
instead of teaching to a group, will just prefer to have a one-on-one conversation with people about this kind of thing. But
Yeah.
one of the most frequently cited reasons for autistic conversion in adulthood is that they wanted a community. Or Christians were nice to them. So they're like, yeah, community, this is great. I think it's actually a fairly important thing for autistic spirituality, is it tends not to be very individualist. It tends to be
Yeah.
very collective focused. And
Yeah.
praying by yourself versus being part of the church, it's often very important for us to be part of the church, which again moves into that drift to the high church, because typically the high church has a very strong view of ecclesiality, in that it's not just about your personal faith, it's about your belonging to the church as well.
Yes.
Your individual spirituality does matter, but what also matters is your participation in a community of believers. And I think that's the best way for autistic people, or that's a way that a lot of autistic people like to think about things. And yeah, there are a lot of reasons for this, but I find a big one is that autistic people just tend to not be very good at things socially and tend not to have very strongly developed communities. But they all so that's one aspect. But the other aspect is we just tend to be less individualistic. We tend to be very focused on other people as well, and very interested in how our actions affect the people and the environment around us. And I think that does heavily factor into the communal piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those are the tendencies, and I think I just want to touch on a few specific topics. One of them is autistic prayer. Prayer it's a struggle for a lot of us. We've talked about it in quite a few ways, but in general, autistic people really struggle with it. And during interviews, one of the questions I ask is, do you pray or do you have a prayer life?
I read the morning office, from the Book of Common Prayer. I do the morning. I say the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. And I usually say that if I'm walking around places, just, have it on repeat. I try sitting in silence and sort of, sort of doing Christian meditation. But I mean, having ADHD as well, you kind of, your brain's, the monkey brain is on overdrive. So I find just using set liturgical prayers to be a way of expressing myself, because I mean, in my younger years, I'd go out and try and pray for 2 or 3 hours, and you just run out of things to say. Do you know what I mean? You just be like, just sit there and just be like, oh, I don't know what else to say now. So I find for me now that, praying other people's words and trying to mean them is meaningful for me.
Yeah, I mean, I try to engage with prayer as often as I can. I think it's really important. I think probably like literally every Christian, it's like, yeah, prayer, really important. Sure wish I did it more. Yeah, I mean, I grew up very sort of like free form, just talk to God vibes, which some people really rock with. I rock with it less. Yeah, I think common generally, probably also particularly common amongst autistic people. So when I discovered like liturgy, the Book of Common Prayer, other pre-written prayers, Catholic prayers like the use of rosary beads, and like repetitive prayers, that was really helpful. So I access prayer through that a lot now. I'm a big fan of a sign of the cross to start and finish the day, so the whole thing can be offered as a prayer. Big fan of the Jesus prayer, huge of the Orthodox Church to come up with that. Yeah, but I'm still an evangelical at heart, so I'll do a bit of chatting to God as well on the side.
Yeah, so I do the examine at night, the Jesuit like cactus and examine. I probably would say that the way that my mom taught me to pray was kind of just like an ongoing conversation with God, which I don't know if I do that because there's no feedback for it really. But I do talk to myself a lot, and a lot of that talking to myself could sound very much like prayer. I don't think that I would say that I like pray for things. Other than like one of my, I don't know if this is an OCD thing or what, but like whenever an ambulance goes by, I'm like, oh God, like I pray that they get to the hospital in time, like, like kind of that thing. But yeah, most of my prayer takes the form of meditation or like thoughtfulness. Reminding myself. I remember being because like I remember being at church when I was growing up, the church, like the home church or whatever, and they used to make us like go around and do spontaneous verbal prayer. And like it was so difficult for me because one, I usually didn't want to talk at that point, but also like when I felt like I couldn't say the things that I actually wanted to say. And so instead I used a lot of filler things, and everyone would be like, yes. And I'd be like, this doesn't mean anything. Huh? Yeah. I'm not a big fan of spontaneous verbal prayer. Yeah, at least not the way that I remember it being.
I do, and a lot of it ends up intercessory prayer. That's really important for me because I'm not one of these people who says that the point of prayer is to change us, right? Prayer is directed toward God and is meant to be conversational with God. But a side benefit of it, for me particularly as an autistic, is that intercessory prayer helps me remember those people that I don't want to forget about and might otherwise forget about. Because for me, a lot of times out of sight is out of mind. And so having a prayer list of people that I remember before God and think about what they're going through is important, not only because I do believe that God changes our reality at times. And I don't have a good algorithm for predicting when or why that is, but I do absolutely believe that prayer is powerful and has the power to alter our reality. But it's also important because of the ways that it changes us too, and particularly the ways that I've seen it change me. So for me, the most fundamental part of my prayer life is corporate worship, is worship together, which is prayer, right? But it's a different kind of prayer, and one which is messy, and one which is imperfect, and one which I think better captures the reality of where we are all at a given moment. But I also try and make it a habit to pray for certain things throughout the day. And or something that works really well for me is prayers that are situational. So if I see an ambulance passing by, saying a prayer for the person that they're going to, or prayer at meal times, for example, to remember the gifts that God's given, those sorts of things.
I think about it mainly in terms of communication. That's the main way I think. I tried meditation and contemplation a couple of times, and that really did work for a while. But I could never I could never work it into my patterns. And so prayer, to me, it's difficult I ask for prayer and I pray mostly around my academic life, funnily enough, where I ask the Lord to lead me and to help me and to bring me into more in line with what his truth is. If there are things that I am believing right now, at any time I read a book, what I want my prayer to be, which isn't, is typically either, Lord, help me to accept the things in this book that are true and to reject the things in this book that are false. Help me to, even in looking at the things that are false in this book, appreciate the heart and spirit behind why they were written. And help me to just grow deeper in your truth as a result. If there are ways this work can help me grow closer to you, either by positive example or negative example, let it be. That's the most consistent time that I pray, funnily enough, which is bad because I'm a husband and father and should be praying more consistently for my family. And I pray with my son before bed every night, so that's good. But yeah, that's I don't really have a whole lot more to say about my prayer life other than it's shaky.
I will admit it's not as good as I would like it to be. But on the whole, I still do find prayer very helpful. I don't quite see it as the magic wish granting sort of thing. I do tend to take more of the view that you pray to God, but you also do your own work. I particularly like liturgical sort of prayer. So, for example, the Anglican or Episcopalian tradition would have set liturgical prayers, which I quite like. That sort of spiritual discipline I find helpful. And I think that's the case with a lot of autistic people, that it's often easier to use something that's pre-written than trying to come up with something on the spot. Yeah, I do enjoy it. My main thing about certain modern worship songs that puts me off a bit is, they just sound like romantic love songs more so than a worship song, which works well for some people, but not so much for me. But as a whole, no, I quite enjoy congregational singing. I'd certainly never sing on my own, but yeah. I also quite like in certain, particularly like higher church Anglican traditions, quite often there's a choir who does most of the singing. So something like evensong. I enjoy that and get quite a lot out of that. But I know on the flip side, a lot of people don't like it because it's too passive, because you are not singing it, you're just listening to the choir. But yeah, I think different things work for different people.
Yeah. So when I remember to, I am like getting to work on like setting a better schedule and regime or all these things. Yeah, like I typically spontaneous because I was raised in like a non-denominational, semi like evangelical Protestant, whatever. But we don't have any of that stuff, which I think is a shame because like I have a sneaking suspicion that being able to read from a book in that way would probably be like much better suited to autistic brains than kind of having to come up with this shit yourself. Yeah, like I was reading a little bit about like hesychasm and Greek Orthodox like prayer practices like that, and I was quite amazed to find out that there were like serious arguments and fights over this stuff that like people were contending as heretical. And I was just looking at this and I'm like, this literally sounds like it's like better just objectively than the ways that like American Protestants are typically like taught to pray. I remember like there were like maybe one or two times I ever like publicly spoke like a prayer aloud in like my church's small groups as a kid, and in both times I I feel like ended up like going on too long and sort of speaking in a way that I thought sounded like authoritative and mature, but was very awkward. And other people noted out that like, what I just said was really weird, so I was really embarrassed about it and never did it again. And I would imagine that's like a pretty common experience.
I think it's important to talk about this because autistic people generally do really struggle with prayer and interacting with God through prayer. And I think it's for a lot of reasons. One of the most obvious ones is that autistic people in general struggle with verbal spontaneous speech. So just coming up and saying things right off the spot. There's a lot of us have thought to speech translation issues where we will have a thought, but then when you have to speak that thought, you can't find the words to say that thought. And we also just tend to think about speaking very differently from other people. I've always thought as speech as simply a information transfer medium. It's just, this is the protocol I use to communicate with other humans, and nothing more than that. And so for me, this is a thing I use when I need another person's ears to hear my words. That's it. And so when you're like, okay, now talk to someone who's not going to talk back to you, a lot of us go, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. Why would I do this? A lot of us think about speech as a reciprocal form of communication where some person A shares their information, then person B shares their information, and you just go back and forth. Another big thing is prayer, especially when it's done in group settings, comes with a lot of like social baggage. There's just a lot going on in a prayer circle that a lot of us hate. And very common, frequent thing that you'll see in a lot of autistic stories is like the intense dread and anxiety of being in a prayer circle and just not knowing what to do because you don't want to be too honest about what you're feeling because that will be looked at bad. You don't want to not respond because that will be bad. So you need to walk this like weird balancing line of like sincere but not too sincere. And it's hard for a lot of us. And there's a book called On the Spectrum by a guy named Daniel J. Bowman. And in one of the chapters, he talks about his experience of what's called popcorn prayer, where everyone sits in a circle. Yeah, everyone sits in a circle and quickly gives a spontaneous prayer, and he's sitting there just hoping no one catches on that he's not saying anything. And that is a universal experience for autistic people who have gone through that, where they're just horrible. Like, please do not say my name. Please do not mention me. Or being like, if I am mentioned, what can I take from... Did someone already say something? How do I take that and repeat it? But not so much that they think I'm copying them, but enough that I can get away with it. And instead of it becoming a genuine form of spiritual expression, it just becomes this massive amount of social dread. Yeah. And again, one of the things we've been talking about is just like spiritual expression and prayer is a method of communication. And just autistic people just do communication different. So when you're told this is how you pray, and when you're taught this is how you pray, you're usually taught it by someone who isn't autistic. And so for someone who doesn't communicate the same way that you do. And we really struggle with this. Autistic people, when they're engaging in prayer, often report serious and significant issues with verbal spontaneous prayer. The only exception I've seen to this are autistic people who I classify as the autistic people with Jesus's best friend model, where their conception of God or their conception of Jesus is as their best friend. And I don't mean this in a condescending way, this in a very genuine and sincere way. It's like their invisible friend who's with them and sitting in the chair next to them.
Yeah.
And they're just a nonverbal friend. And so those autistic Christians don't have much issue with this. But those autistic Christians also do not make up the majority of autistic Christians. They make up a small minority, but they're still there. And I have talked to quite a few of them. So that is an experience. However, the vast majority of us, when we pray, we usually stick to meditative, contemplative, or structured prayer, where what we're doing is intentional. It has a structure. Someone else has written the words for us, so we don't have to think about them. We just have to read the words that someone else has written and think about what we're saying. And a lot of Protestant traditions will denigrate this and being like, you're not speaking from the heart. And it's, sure, you're right. Just because I'm reading someone else's words doesn't mean I myself can't mean them. And I always found that talking point really dumb, because it's like, when you're singing a song, you're not coming up with the lyrics on the spot. Like when you're singing a hymn, you're reading a prayer, you're just singing it to music.
Yeah.
You're doing the thing that you're telling me not to do.
Yeah, and yet we can understand that singing a hymn or a worship song can be a moving experience that speaks to someone's heart. So why would reading a prayer that's already been written be different? It's especially when you look at a lot of the prayers that existed in ancient times, right through medieval period, even up to and including like the 19th century. They read like poetry, and and poetry has been held as this very highly valued thing. We have an entire section in our Bibles dedicated to different forms of poetry. And those are highly valued in a lot of these circles. And yet somehow when it comes to these written prayers, the attitude is, no, that's a kind of dead in the water sort of thing. That never quite made sense to me. And I think that's something that a lot of neurotypical people would need to rethink, because when you approach these written prayers as a form of worship, like you would with music, like you would with the poetic scriptures, then you can see why a lot of us as autistic people do enjoy reading them. A lot of the times we have difficulties articulating how we think and feel, but that doesn't mean we have the absence of those thoughts and feelings. And a lot of the times those written prayers articulate them in ways that we struggle with.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to build on that, so there are quite a few studies about autistic emotional expression, and one of the ones I found most interesting about this topic particularly is one found that autistic people are much more comfortable using emotional expression through reaction GIF or emoji. So if you ask an autistic person to explain how they feel, they often find it difficult to find the words, but they did find that they found a lot more like they were being heard, or they were able to express themselves if they're able to select from a series of like GIFs or memes or pictures or emojis. And another thing is that autistic emotional expression can often come through quoting of a book or a movie or a song lyric or something like that, where oftentimes we struggle to articulate our own emotions or our own feelings. But if someone else articulates it, we find it very easy to go, oh yeah, I recognize what that is. And that's what I'm going through. And I wouldn't be able to put it to words myself, but hearing someone else say it or seeing it expressed, I can easily identify that's the thing that I like, or that's the thing that I am experiencing and feeling. And that applies to prayer, like 100%, right? That is the way that autistic people pray, is if you could pray through reaction GIF, if you wanted spontaneous prayer through reaction GIF, autistic people would have no problem with it.
Oh my gosh.
But this is, And unfortunately, a lot of autistic people get shamed for it. A lot of autistic people get told, you're not doing it right. But it's, honestly, I just think it's ignorance. People just don't know. And if they did know, they probably wouldn't be acting like that. And I think this is one of the situations where just a little education can genuinely help bridge a lot of gaps. Yeah, so 2 final things that I want to touch on with respect to autistic spirituality, because I feel like they come up so often that I should just address them here. So we've talked about this a lot, but one overarching trend that I get from a lot of autistic people is they're not doing great a lot of the time. To put it lightly, a lot of autistic experience with spirituality isn't a super positive one. And I think it's mostly because of the way that normal spirituality is sold to them. So it's like the fish climbing a tree quote, where like they're told you should have these sorts of spontaneous emotional experiences with Christianity, and they don't. Like they don't have any of those experiences. And they often, a lot of them will feel like they've taken a wrong turn and they've done something bad, or they haven't done something right. And their church community will often be like, yeah, I think you've properly diagnosed the problem. Like, you must have some hidden sin in your life. That's why you don't feel anything. And it leads to a lot of their relationship with spirituality being a lot of them trying to navigate their feelings of isolation, loneliness, and sadness. And that is a very common theme. So one thing that a lot of autistic people will ask me is, why don't I hear God? Why does it feel like everyone else is hearing God, but I'm not? And it's very hard to answer, because on one hand, you have people like Pinsent and Stump who are like, it's because you're autistic. Autistic people just can't feel God. And a lot of times your personal experience is like, are these guys right? Maybe I am genuinely cut off from God because I don't feel anything. And I feel empty. I feel lonely. I feel like something is missing. And a lot of times, just to be frank, autistic people experience an enormous amount of social rejection and feel very lonely throughout their entire life. And Christianity is often no exception to that rule. And the loneliness they feel in their social life is something they also feel in Christianity. Because in their social life, they expect that people will like them, that people will talk to them, that people will want to be their friends. And then people aren't. And so that expectation of being treated like a normal human and having other people like you is something that they know they don't experience, but should. And I find in a lot of places that also applies to spirituality, where they are told you should be feeling something, you should be experiencing something along these specific lines, and they don't. There is often the sentiment that is sometimes described to me, and this is the direct quote, where an autistic Christian who wanted to remain anonymous said, I feel like there's a party that everyone else was invited to, and they're all there, and I'm just sitting in my house, and I don't know how to get to it, or if they would even let me in if I tried to go. And that, unfortunately, is a significant experience of a lot of autistic Christians. That may not be all they experience. They can have lots of other experiences. But there is this expectation that is set out that you will feel an inner warmth. You will feel a social connection with God. You will feel all these different things. No one talks about autistic joy mediated through intellectual engagement. No one talks about those positive social autistic interactions that you can express. But what they do is they often talk about the joy of different types of relational understandings of God that a lot of autistic people have very difficult times understanding and interacting.
Yeah.
And they will try extremely hard. And they will
Yes.
do everything that they're supposed to do. They will, they're like, you have unconfessed sin. They will sit there for hours confessing
Yeah.
every single thing they could have possibly thought
gosh,
about.
yeah.
They will drive themselves insane doing all these things so they could have these spiritual experiences that other people are having. But oftentimes we just feel nothing. And that is an experience I've had. That's an experience a lot of us have had. And lighten the mood a bit, I remember talking to a non-autistic Christian who was talking to me about how they were feeling like God had stopped talking to them. And all I could think about was that Batman quote with Bane. You have merely adopted the darkness. I was born into the darkness. Molded by it, shaped by it. I didn't experience the light until I was a man, and it was blinding.
And I think of that line actually where it goes, first time.
And it's like that. We've been talking about like the good parts and the positive parts of autistic spirituality, but often there is this part that a lot of autistic people don't want to talk about and don't want to express because we're afraid of how it will be weaponized against us.
I think it's also important to know as well that something else that impacts upon this spiritual isolation we've touched on so in depth about the theological side of it, of how churches describe how spirituality is meant to be expressed and how often, that is very much neurotypical hegemony. But I think that neurotypical hegemony also plays out in the social dynamics of a lot of church communities, which also contributes to this sense of this feeling of spiritual isolation. A lot of autistic people who are born into or join churches obviously have this sense that, oh my gosh, we're all Christians, we're all meant to be kind, and so we all include each other in things. Very often, autistic people in churches find themselves also on the social outs in their church communities. It might not even be something as full on as bullying or anything like that. It can just be that, look, nothing goes beyond a general hello, how is your week? And then you hear that through the grapevine that, oh yeah, this family is organizing a post-church lunch and yet again, you're not invited. I've heard that from peers as well. Some churches, especially the sacramental ones, tend to be very family oriented because the vast majority of sacraments occur in the first 12 or 13 years of a child's life. So there is a lot of family involvement in those stages. But autistic Christians are disproportionately single well into our 30s and 40s. So we also have this struggle that we don't really have anything to support us as single people. On top of that, a lot of the more charismatic or evangelical churches, when they do have very active evangelizing ministries, they tend to go in this model that you go for the people who have the most social capital because they're more likely to bring more people into church after themselves. So you're not going to find that with a lot of autistic people because we're not the popular kids in school. We're not joining sororities and fraternities in colleges and universities, just to put it out there for the Americans listening to this. Student societies, we don't tend to join student societies in non-American universities. We're not the social capital that a lot of these outreach programs aim for. And so when we see that happening as well, there's very much this sense that, okay, we're the weird hanger-on that turns up to services, but outside of that, are we a nuisance of some sort? And gosh, this can even happen in places where we really feel like we fit in. I've had this experience myself a few months ago as of the recording of this episode, where I was at an important pre-synod listening session for my diocese, which is the Catholic Diocese of Parramatta. They were having their first ever synod. It's huge. It was a historical turning point for us, and I was really excited to be at this listening session. And there were even people who turned up who I knew, and none of them invited me to their tables. And I spent a good chunk of that time sitting at the table by myself and just realizing that people were actively avoiding my table. And that is a very sucky feeling when you realize, wait a minute, this isn't just a case of people sticking with the people they know. They were looking at my table and then going to another stranger's table because they were going out of their way to not sit at mine, because obviously it gave off a vibe. I believe I had discussed it before in this show, but like this is a perfect example of how that can also have a huge knock on someone's spirituality as an autistic Christian.
Yeah. And I want to talk about this not because this gets weaponized against autistic people, right? And what I wanted to say is this is not actually a symptom of you being defective. This is simply a symptom of you being autistic.
Yeah.
The vast majority of us don't have these experiences, unfortunately. Even though a lot of us want them and a lot of us want to experience them, a lot of us will encounter God through a slow, contemplative, and unexciting reflection that you won't feel and you will probably experience in an intellectual capacity, not the other capacity. And it sucks.
Yeah.
It does. I know it does. And I know a lot of us want it.
Especially when it feels like you're the only one. Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention it because I know I deal with a lot of autistic people struggling with it. And a lot of times, the first time I talk to them is the first time they hear you're not alone. And you are not the only one who deals with this. And it simply might be the case that you just never have these experiences. And that's fine. You may not think that's fine now. You might be able to come to terms with it later. But this is a really imperfect metaphor, and I realize it has some issues with it, but the way I always try to explain this to people is if you are a working class Spanish-speaking man from Peru, and you only read Christian material that is targeted to a middle upper class suburban white woman living in America, their experience of spirituality and your experience of spirituality may never overlap at all. And that isn't a defect in anyone. That's not a defect in her. That's not a defect in you. God could be speaking to you and you're simply not understanding the language. But here's the other thing. I don't think God only speaks to people in one language.
No.
And one thing that a lot of autistic priests that I've talked to, when they're trying to figure this out, they say, you know, if you are that Spanish guy, would God come to you talking to you in English? Probably not. Like, he does talk in English to some people because some people speak English. But to you, he's probably going to speak Spanish or whatever language you're speaking. And you may really want to hear God speak to you in the same way that he speaks to other people, but he just might not. And you might not be equipped to hear it.
Yeah.
It's just the reality of the beast. And that's just what happens. And I don't really have a lot of more comforting things to say because I know a lot of autistic people genuinely crave these experiences that they will never have. And I just wanted to make sure that we talk about that. And that leads into another thing, which is that autism is typically comorbid with a lot of other mental health issues. People don't like the term comorbidity, but I don't know. I think it's fine. Well, what I mean by that is autistic people are rarely just autistic. There are usually other things that come along with it. And Christians have historically not been great at addressing negative mental health conditions like depression or anxiety or a whole host of other things. And a lot of autistic people deal with these. And a lot of autistic people deal with these in quite a significant way. Like, we are disproportionately depressed, whether that's like a neurochemical thing or just depression is what you get when you try to live in a society that isn't built for you and constantly rejects you. Like, what's the cause? I don't know. But the reality is a lot of us deal with, like, especially anxiety and depression.
Yes.
And amongst that, other things. And I find the church is often really bad at dealing with these issues. And they often treat them as personal faults, moral failings, or signs of sin. The reason you're depressed is you have unaddressed sin, or the reason you're anxious is you're not trusting God enough. That gets thrown against and weaponized against autistic people all the time.
Yeah.
And I would just like to say, I'm not a theologian, but I just don't think that's the case. I think the reason you are depressed is because you are dealing with depression, not because there's like unaddressed sin or something like that. And anxiety is like an irrational thing that happens to you and your brain after certain things go on. Like, this isn't like a failure of being a Christian if you have anxiety or depression. It's just a reality of being a human. And a lot of autistic people don't hear that message. So I just wanted to, throw that on as a caveat. Like, I know a lot of us struggle with these types of issues. These types of issues are not indicative of spiritual failing. They are indicative of mental health issues. That's the only thing that they indicate. If you're dealing with these things and someone is telling you're dealing with them because of the spiritual issue, that person is wrong. A lot of us also deal with like suicidality. I know I have lost a few friends to it who are on the autism spectrum. I'm sure most people listening to this podcast know someone who has been affected by it. It is something we deal with. It is not a personal failing. It is simply the reality of living in a world that you don't fit well into. I don't think it's a good solution. I don't think it's something you should do, but it is something that a lot of autistic people struggle with, myself included. And I just want to throw it out there that these are things that a lot of us struggle with. And these are things that are often seen as like a failure to properly trust God or a failure to address your own sin. And I don't think that's the case. I think mental health is a very complicated set of neurochemistry, social context, environmental response, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And it, despite what some Christians might say, I don't think it's indicative of you not like praying hard enough or whatever. Yeah. So anyway, that's all I have to say about autistic spirituality. Hopefully this was useful to people. Hopefully this has maybe made some people clarified some points of confusion that I often come across, and hopefully recontextualize things in a way that helps. I think that's all I have to say. If you have any closing remarks, you can go for it.
Yeah, I just hope that through this episode, people listening in, for autistic people, I hope yet again that this has been validating, because I know I felt very seen by a lot of the points discussed from that research. I certainly feel a lot less alone in how I practice and how I feel about those spiritual practices and the like. I hope, again, for anyone who is not autistic and is listening in, I hope this has been very informative as well. I think it's just to go off of the sort of the sadder points that did have to be raised towards the end. I hope this is an opportunity for your ministries or in your churches or anything of the like to start really seeking out how best to support your autistic members in your churches. And that would include reaching out to external support networks and organizations that are there to support autistic people and are autistic led. That's very important, because it's no use to help us through this journey without the help and support of autistic people outside of your churches and ministries, who can provide a lot of expertise and additional support. And don't shy away from connecting with psychologists and therapists and that who are trauma-informed, who are neurodiverse in their intentions. It's so important, just as much as we have a church community, to also be working with the wider community, not just for yourselves, but for your autistic members in the church. None of us can do this alone, and don't be afraid to reach out for that support.
Yeah, and I just want to say something you mentioned there. If you are looking for professional support as a autistic person, understand that a lot of people who aren't autistic don't understand autism and can sometimes give really bad advice. So the best thing I would do is exactly what Amy said, and find someone who specifically knows about autism and is sensitive toward these things. There are quite a few autistic priests you can find on Twitter. You can contact me and I can see if I could get you in contact with them. There are lots of people that I know and met through my personal journeys that I can maybe help you speak with if you need that help. But yeah, I would say make sure when you go looking for help, you look for someone who understands what autism is. As I think we've been pointing out, it's fairly important. Anyway, I think that's it. I'll see you later.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. If you're interested in contacting me, you can find me at christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com or Twitter @ChristianityOn. You can find Amy at It Began in the 90s. It's 90 with a 90, also on Twitter. We'll be doing some Q&A episodes after the main podcast is finished. If you have any questions about my research, you can email me or send me a message on Twitter with your questions, and I will get to addressing them during that Q&A. If you want to do a live Q&A, schedule a talk or a presentation about my research for your church, small group, or just as an individual person, you can find me at all the places I've already mentioned. If you'd like to join a Discord of like-minded autistics, please send me a message at one of the above listed places, and I will send you an invitation link. Thank you.